This is an in-depth study of the logia, or sayings, of the Gospel of Thomas for the purpose of recovering the inner circle or initiatic teachings of Yeshua. The inspiration for this course came through a church known as Star in the East and Mercedes Baleda, who is its founder, who want to be able to relate the secret teachings or the initiatic teachings, the inner teachings of Yeshua, to those of Buddhism. And there is so much relationship that it's very, very important to present the information. So that's why I'm doing the course. And Mercedes is the person that I'm with, I'm instructing and giving the information to, so you will hear her voice from time to time. The goals of the study are to understand how the inner circle or initiatic teachings of Yeshua are similar to the Eastern wisdom tradition developed in Hinduism and Buddhism, and use the Gospel of Thomas as a primary source of inner circle teachings, of which we have other sources like the Secret Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, although most of the so-called Gnostic Gospels are not related at all to the teachings of Yeshua. Specific concepts we're going to deal with and we're going to find in the teachings of Yeshua at the inner circle level are self-liberation, non-attachment, karma, spiritual perfection, union with the divine, and spiritual practices that promote spiritual perfection and divine union in flesh and on earth. Our methodology is to analyze the Coptic text of the Gospel of Thomas to recover the Greek text of the oldest written kernel of that Gospel. We have some of this with the Greek Oxyrhynchus Papyri in the New Testament parallels in the Q source. We have Crumb's Coptic Dictionary for meanings and Coptic Greek equivalents, so we can get to the Greek that way. We can look at, of course, of all the meanings of the Coptic word as we have it, but most of the Coptic meanings are very set and very simple, so we don't have a lot to explore in that. And then we'll use these original Greek manuscript terms because the Gospel of Thomas was translated from a Greek version. We'll use these original Greek manuscript terms to recover the orally transmitted spoken Aramaic words and concepts used by Yeshua and his disciples. We'll use Abbott Smith and Bauer and a bunch of other things that give us the common Greek Aramaic equivalents. And there are various other Old Testament Hebrew lexica we can use for these things. So we can get from the Greek rather easily back to the Aramaic, and we can get from the Coptic back to the Greek. So we'll translate and interpret each of the logia line by line and compare Yeshua's historical teachings to the Eastern wisdom tradition. Just for some comments at the very beginning, if we want to compare Buddhist Dharma and Jewish Halakha, Mahayana Buddhism was contemporary with Yeshua, and Dharma, which means divine, something like divine spiritual law or societal and cosmic duty and practice and so on, was understood through spiritual concepts and practices taught by Buddhist masters. And extended dharmic practices were formalized as lam rim and ritualized as Buddhist tantras and transmitted only to advanced disciples. Initiatic permissions or empowerments were granted for advanced disciples to practice. Now, in Jewish Halakha, which was common during the Hellenistic Jewish period in the mysticism, the Kabbalistic and Messianic and wisdom school mysticism that informed Yeshua and his disciples, the meaning of Halakha was a way of walking or following, and it had to do with divine spiritual law. The spiritual concepts and practices were taught by a Hellenistic Jewish master who was known as a Mar, and that's why we call him Mar Yeshua, to his disciples who were Talmidim. And Yeshua's constant invitation we find in the Greek New Testament, halkeni, which is always translated in Greek meaning follow me. It means follow my halakha, follow my way. The private teachings that were transmitted orally were known as Kabbalah. That's the meaning of the word Kabbalah. And secret interpretation of Torah and the writings, the Scripture and Haggadah, the Messianic lessons, all formed part of the Kabbalah teachings, the Kabbalistic teachings, and we are able to get glimpses into them through the Old Testament so-called Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha and the other literature that was read by Yeshua, and that was the Bible that was used by Yeshua and his people, which were different than the Bible we use today. There were inner circle halakhic practices for advanced disciples of a Jewish Mar, and they included Kabbalistic ratzim, which were secrets or mysteries, hidden things of heaven, and wisdom school practices. Merkaba mysticism, or the ratzim of interior ascent to the chariot throne of God through the heavens. And initiatic permissions were granted to advanced disciples to practice this. So Kabbalistic Jewish halakhic teachings and transmissions can be seen as comparable to Buddhist tantras or the extended and advanced yogas authorized by Buddhist masters, and that is what we find reflected in the Gospel of Thomas. It is the mystery teachings, the inner halakhic teachings. So basically, starting with the Coptic Gospel of Thomas and informing ourselves with whatever Greek sources we can get from the Oxyrhynchus Papyri and so on in these parallels, we're going to try to get back to what the original manuscript Greek words were, and that's not very difficult because Crumb's Coptic Dictionary gives us the Greek equivalents. And then we're going to take those Greek words in order to get back to the original dictated and spoken Aramaic words and concepts that were used. And this little picture I happen to like shows a man dictating. And this is the way the prophets, very often, their teachings were kept, either by their disciples who wrote them down, or disciples of the prophets who gave them orally to others who became scribes and wrote them down. So we want to understand the original Basor, or so-called Gospel of Yeshua, and to translate and interpret the original meanings of the Logia and compare them with the Eastern wisdom tradition. Now, what is the Gospel of Thomas? Well, it's a collection of 114 teachings attributed to Jesus, which in Aramaic would be Yeshua, the name Jesus that we know that's been currently used for about 200 years. These are not discourses, but short sayings. We call them logia, but they're not all really technically logia, or they're sayings or allegorical parables, which in Aramaic are called mashlim. And many of them are independent variants of teachings that are preserved in the synoptic gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called synoptic because they all tell basically the same story. Matthew and Luke are dependent upon Mark, which seems to have been the earliest. And then Matthew and Luke each have their own special material. And then Matthew and Luke have a very important source we call Q, which is a whole lot of material that they have. They share between themselves. It was some kind of a written source that we don't have extant anymore. So unlike the synoptic materials, which were composed in Greek, many of the sayings in Thomas show evidence of Semitic language construction and Aramaisms. That means they were originally Aramaic. And Aramaic was the language spoken by Yeshua and his disciples. It looked like this. And later, about a century later, Aramaic was not written in the Hebrew alphabet anymore. It was written in the Syriac, similar to an Arabic alphabet, but it was still the same language. Now, scholar Malin Smith says this, and I'm quoting him because it's good information. He says more than half of the material in the Gospel of Thomas, about 79 sayings, is paralleled in the canonical Gospels. 27 are in Mark and the other synoptics. 46 are in the Q material in Matthew and Luke. And 12 echo material, that is special material from Matthew, and 1 is only found in Luke. And he says that there are 4 main reasons why scholars who have studied Thomas conclude that it is independent of synoptic tradition. The first is there's no narrative frame. If the compiler of Thomas drew on these sayings from the canonical narrative Gospels, he would have had to very cleverly remove every trace of the stories in which the synoptic writers embedded them. We wouldn't know which gospel it would have come from. And there's a non-synoptic order. If the compiler of Thomas drew these sayings from the synoptic gospels, he totally scrambled them and separated the adjoining sayings and scattered them at random. No one has yet proven that the sayings in Thomas are arranged according to any logical pattern, except I will show you that they're arranged mnemonically, as though they were came from memory. And there are random parallels. There's sayings in Thomas that sometimes echo Mark, sometimes Matthew, sometimes Luke, but there's no clear pattern of dependence on any one text. And it seems to be a much more primitive form. The sayings in Thomas are often logically simpler than their synoptic counterparts. If the compiler drew these sayings from the synoptic gospels, he edited out the traits characteristic of each writer. While some, and as we'll see later on, actually several, synoptic parallels in Thomas have Gnostic embellishments, these are easily removed. So we can get back behind Thomas. Now, Malin Smith summarizes my views and those of many other scholars in these words. Together, these traits of Thomas make it highly unlikely that any synoptic gospel was used as its source. In fact, the random, eclectic character of the contents of Thomas makes it a more primitive composition than the synoptic saying source that scholars call Q, which we would date at about 50 AD or the 50 in the Christian era. While many individual sayings in Thomas may be of late Gnostic origin, the core of the collection, that is the sayings with the synoptic parallels, is probably as old or older than the composition of the canonical gospel narratives, which were done from 50 to 90 CE. To date this gospel any later makes it hard to explain the general lack of features dependent on the synoptics. Well, those are the kind of ways that scholars say they conclude this is really earlier than the New Testament. To this I add that the reason many of the Thomas logia do not appear in the New Testament Gospels is that they represent inner circle or initiatic teachings, like the secret Gospel of Mark, which were given privately to quote the secret Gospel of Mark, quote, those who are being perfected. Now, the language of Thomas is important. It's in Coptic, but it's a tertiary language. The entire document has been recovered and restored from Nag Hammadi manuscripts that were discovered in a cave on the Nile River in 1945. It's written in a late Egyptian language using a Greek alphabet called Coptic, and this is what the Coptic alphabet looks like. Mostly like Greek capital letters, but a few more letters added to make up for some other Egyptian forms. There are Greek fragments of the Gospel of Thomas in the Oxyrhynchus papyri that were previously unidentifiable. We didn't know what it was. Using the Coptic, hypothetical Greek versions of Thomas were reconstructed by scholars. Thomas was translated from an earlier Greek version, it's very clear, exhibiting Semitic or Aramaic language idioms and constructions. For example, Yaakov HaZedek, that means James the Just, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. That's a Semitic idiom, and that's something you don't find in Greek. It comes right from Aramaic. So the original language from which it came, it was dictated to a bilingual scribe by a disciple of Yeshua before about 50 CE, and the original language was Aramaic. That was the language of Yeshua. Now, it's important to understand that the so-called Gospel of Thomas, which is a collection of logia, or sayings, of Jesus, of Yeshua, is very, very similar to another lost document that survives only as it's quoted in the New Testament by the Gospels. And this has been identified as a source for the Gospels of Matthew and Luke ever since biblical scholarship has been developing for over 100 years. It's a lost written Greek source that was used to construct the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. We call it Q. Now, if you take a look at these two excerpts from the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, the same excerpt, you'll see all the words are in Greek. All the words in red are word for word, expression for expression, case for case, exact identicals. And we have a very large amount of material between Matthew and Luke that's this way. And it does not come from Mark. You see, Matthew and Luke both used Mark as a source in their own ways. So we know that Mark was earlier than Matthew and Luke. But they also use another document that Mark did not have access to. And that document provided them with a whole host of things, the so-called Sermon on the Mount and all kinds of other things. We called it Q after the German word Kell, which means what is this, and dated it earlier than any of the Gospels, somewhere between AD 30 and AD 50, right after the time of the crucifixion of Yeshua until the time of Paul. This would be the first generation of Jewish oral tradition. The disciples of Yeshua kept notes, as we'll learn when we learn something about the secret Gospel of Mark, and they transmitted their body of information to other people who then wrote it down in the language that was common to the realm, both for the Jews of the diaspora and for the Gentiles, which was Greek, but it was not a very high-class Greek. It was a common Greek called a Koine Greek. And we find that this Q source is a collection of logia and parables very like Thomas. In fact, they tell a lot of the same parables and logia, but independently and in a different kind of way. And in Thomas, they retell these logia in a way that belongs to a secret tradition rather than a public tradition. Now you might ask, well, how do we know that all this common material between Matthew and Luke isn't there because Matthew copied Luke or Luke copied Matthew? Well, because when you study the material between them and you see the slight differences, here you'll see, for example, in this text you'll see some of it in black and some of it in red. The red material is identical. The black material has been changed or redacted by the editor, the writer, in his own way. And if you look at all those changes that are made by each of the writers in their own ways, you'll see that this was a common source for both rather than one relying on the other to copy from them. So it's an independent source, the Q source. Its probable origin was in the memorized teachings of Yeshua that were dictated by an original Jewish disciple to a Greek scribe. And this was put into, as I say, the Koine Greek, which is the common language of people that were not primary Greek speakers. They were usually had learned it as a second language. And then it was circulated among the congregations for a generation until it was used as sources for things. In fact, this Q source came out of the first generation, became part of the second generation. It was circulated for about a generation before it was copied. So it became was copied in third generation materials among the Gentiles. Now, many scholars today recognize that Thomas preserves another such lost collection of the logia of Yeshua, but with this distinction. It reflects an inner circle or secret group of teachings that were given only to the closest disciples. Interpretations of a lot of the more public parables and things that were put out in the Q source now have more esoteric meanings. So we're going to take a look at the secret Gospel of Mark because it gives us a lot of information about how material was transmitted from the earliest times and written down by the earliest Gospel writers, and it's an example of a lost inner circle manuscript.
Now, what about the existence of secret teachings from Jesus, Mar Yeshua? They're always claimed, of course, the Gnostics claim to have these teachings, but there are some things scholars have in hand that show us much more than just what's said in the New Testament. You can read where Jesus says, I speak to you plainly, but to those outside I speak only in parables. Or you can find in the New Testament where Jesus says, do not throw your pearls to the swine. And where he has an inner circle, he doesn't, not just everybody gets to go and eat the Messianic banquet, break bread with Yeshua, and learn the highest teachings. Only his inner circle does. And so it's very clear that he had an inner circle of disciples, and some of them, even 3 of them, he took to the top of the mountain, and they experienced what's known as the Transfiguration and so on, which is probably mere Kabbal mysticism. But we now have some very interesting things, one of which is the secret Gospel of Mark, which I'll be telling you about in a minute, that give us some clues as to what might have been going on that was not written down and part of public transmission in Christianity. Morton Smith, a great scholar that I had some contact with at one time, went to the Marsaba monastery in Greece, and he discovered this manuscript. And it was a letter written by Clement of Alexandria. And it was a fragment of that letter. It wasn't, the whole thing wasn't there, but it was written to a church official who was very, very upset because a rather evil sectarian leader had gotten a hold of the secret gospel and had turned it over, had redacted it, turned it around to reflect his homosexual theologies and theories, and applied them to Yeshua and so on. It's written to Theodore, who is the church official, and it is basically Clement telling him that this sect of Carpocrates got a hold of this by seducing a deacon of the church, and that this is highly secret and material that belonged to the Church of Alexandria, because it was another gospel written by the disciple of Peter named Mark. Now, I'm going to read you from that letter and from the secret gospel. Many scholars consider the secret gospel to be authentic. There are others who think it is not authentic. They think that Smith forged it, but this is really highly unlikely. This is probably a real thing. We don't have the actual gospel, just parts from it, but we have the letter from Clement of Alexandria that corrects the gospel as it has been perverted by Carpocrates. And we have this and much other evidence of an inner circle tradition that Yeshua had, that was a secret tradition that was taught only orally, as in the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition, from mouth to ear, as it was, in fact, the whole first generation of Christianity wasn't written down. It was all transmitted orally, and it was transmitted because there was a great deal of esoteric material involved. Now, one of the evidences that we have for inner kinds of teachings is transmitted without much comment and without any real explanation in the Markan tradition of Mark, and that's we generally think of this as the transfiguration on the mountaintop at night, where three disciples, James, Peter, and John, are taken up and witness Yeshua talking to Moses and Elijah, and go through an experience there that they don't understand very much of. But there's much evidence that there were inner tradition teachings, and one of the things that was a lot of this was associated with was the stories we find in John's Gospel about the raising of Lazarus. And Yeshua is quoted even in the public Gospels. I say unto you I speak plainly, but for those outside all is in parables and those sort of thing. And do not cast your pearls to the swine, as I mentioned before. There's a lot of evidence for the existence of secret teachings from our Yeshua. And he speaks publicly to crowds, huge crowds of hearers. But he trains 70 disciples, those that actually walk his halakha and go with him. Traditionally, there are 70. And he has traditionally 12 disciples, although we think there were probably, who became apostles, although we think there were probably about 17, and some of them were women, not just men. So it's very clear that as you get closer to Yeshua, you move in closer to his inner circle, and you receive higher teachings and more advanced kinds of discipleship. Now, this is a transcription of the text that we find in the secret Gospel of Mark, and this is a photograph that Morton Smith took of the pages because they would not let him remove the material from the monastery. And we know from later evidence that the material was there, and it was later moved so that nobody could get to it. And that was the abbot of the monastery told people that. So people that accused Morton Smith of lying about this, even though he had the photographs and etc., don't really have much of a leg to stand on. But what I'm going to do is read to you about this and tell you the story of this. So in the summer of 1958, he discovered, some 17 years after he'd first visited the Greek Orthodox monastery of Mar Saba during the winter of 1941, he returned with the permission of the Patriarch to study and catalog the manuscripts there. And these are treasuries and repositories of very ancient manuscripts. And then on a certain afternoon, he deciphered a text that began, "From the letters of the most holy Clement, the author of the Stromatis, to Theodore." Now, Clement of Alexandria is one of the earliest church fathers. This text attributed to Clement was written in cursive Greek, which is what was written at that time, on 2.5 pages on the back of a printed edition of the letters of Ignatius of Antioch. And that's what was often done. Paper was very scarce, papyrus was very scarce, animal skins and vellum were very scarce, and so they were used over again, or they were written, they were smudged out or painted over and more things written on top of them, and then you get what's called a palimpsest. That is a text where there's 2 or 3 texts, one on top of another, that's been covered over, and so on. So he photographed the manuscript, and the only thing he had to demonstrate that he had seen this and what was in the manuscript were these photographs. And a lot of scholars examined them in order to attempt to date the scribal hand, because we can date things by the scribal handwriting. And the consensus would date it, the hand, about 1750. That means whoever transcribed it in the 18th century. In other words, you see, these documents don't last more than 100 years at the very most. They have to be written over and over again. Nobody has any Xerox machines. So this was, in fact, most of the scholars concluded, transcribed then. Those who later accused Smith of forging the document would have to go up against those scholars who took a look at the hand. And then 15 years later, the scholarly and popular editions of the text appeared, and there was a big controversy. Since Morton Smith is the only scholar who actually saw the original text, and his photographs are the only other verification, a lot of people, and because the material was so controversial, the idea of Yeshua, Jesus initiating people and doing things like that, then Smith was accused of possible forgery. He made refutations. If you're interested, there's quite a correspondence about this. There are other scholars who made attempts to see the manuscript, but as a witness to its existence, Thomas Talley tells us, he says, "I can cite the archimandrite Melliton of the Jerusalem Greek Patriarchate, who, after the publication of Smith's work, found the volume at Mar Saba and removed it to the Patriarchal Library, and the Patriarchal Librarian, Father Callistos, who told me that the manuscript, 2 folios, had been removed from the printed volume and is being repaired." And these guys, the monastery people, are not real generous about giving out their stuff to scholars. And but someday the actual originals of this may turn up. But what's very interesting is the contents of this letter, and I'm going to read you what it basically says. It's a letter of Clement that's written to commend and support Theodore for his opposition to the Gnostic Carpocratians. They were libertine Gnostics who allegedly maintained they were free to do whatever they wished. They say that circumstances are evil and good only by human opinion. Very good Greek philosophy. And the the Carpocratians were a problem in the Alexandrian church in the 2nd, 3rd century. In his discussion of the Carpocratian Gnostics, the letter of Clement uses typical heresiological terminology. They've gone astray as wandering stars. The wandering stars, you see, the theory that we're going to be looking at, as a matter of fact, is that we find in the Timaeus of Plato and in the Kore Cosmou of Hermes Trismegistus, is that we are all associated as souls with stars that move, but in the original creation, the stars didn't follow their proper courses, and so the souls were taken from the stars and incarnated in order to become improved, in order to perfect the souls. And so to call somebody a wandering star is basically to call them a soul in need of very much improvement that has not yet made much progress, and so on. So I'm going to read you what Clement says. Now Clement starts out by saying, "You did well in silencing the unspeakable teachings of the Carpocratians, for these are the wandering stars referred to in the prophecy, who wander, blah, 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 blah. For priding themselves in knowledge, as I say, of the deep things of Satan, they do not know that they are casting themselves away into the nether world of the darkness," and etc., etc. And he talks about how bad they are. Now, of the things that they keep saying about the divinely inspired gospel according to Mark, some are altogether falsifications, and others, even if they do contain some elements, nevertheless are not reported truly. For the true things, being mixed with inventions, are falsified, so that, as the saying goes, even the salt loses its savor. As for Mark, then, during Peter's stay in Rome, he wrote an account of the Lord's doing, not, however, declaring all of them, nor yet hitting at the secret ones, but selecting what he thought most useful for increasing the faith of those who were being instructed. But when Peter died a martyr, Mark came over to Alexandria, bringing both his own notes and those of Peter, from which he transferred to his former book the things suitable to whatever makes for progress towards Gnosis. Thus he composed a more spiritual gospel for the use of those who were being perfected. Nevertheless, he did not divulge the things not to be uttered, nor did he write down the hierophantic teachings of the Lord. But to stories already written he added yet others, and moreover brought in certain sayings of which he knew the interpretation would, as a mystagogue, lead the hearers into the innermost sanctuary of that truth hidden by the 7 veils. Thus in some he prepared matters, neither grudgingly nor incautiously, in my opinion, and dying, he left his composition to the church in 1 Verso Alexandria, where it is even yet most carefully guarded, being read only to those who are being initiated into the great mysteries. But since the foul demons are always devising destruction for the race of men, Carpocrates, instructed by them and using deceitful arts, so enslaved a certain presbyter of the church in Alexandria that he got from him a copy of the secret gospel, which he both interpreted according to his blasphemous and carnal doctrine, and moreover polluted, mixing with the spotless and holy words utterly shameless lies. From this mixture is drawn off the teaching of the Carpocratians. To them, therefore, as I said above, one must never give way, blah, blah, blah. So now he says some very interesting things about maintaining initiatic secrecy. He says, "Nor when they should put forth their falsification should one concede that the secret gospel is by Mark, but should even deny it on oath, for, quote, not all true things are to be said to all men. For this reason the wisdom of God through Solomon advises, answer the fool from his folly, teaching that the light of the truth should be hidden from those who are mentally blind. Again it says, from him who has shall not be taken away, and let the fool walk in darkness. But we are, quote, children of light, having been illuminated by the day spring of the Spirit of the Lord from on high. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, it says, there is liberty, for all things are pure to the pure. To you, therefore, I shall not hesitate to answer the questions you have asked, refuting the falsifications by the very words of the gospel." And then he goes through and says, okay, here's where the Carpocratians have polluted the gospel. He says, for example, and they were in the road going up to Jerusalem, and what follows, until after 3 days he shall arise. The secret gospel brings the following material, word for word, and now we get a word from the secret gospel. Now this is what's very interesting. Not only the fact that there were secret and initiatic teachings, and that they were so important that you should even lie on oath that they existed, but here's the story, the real quote of an event. It's a story of Yeshua initiating a man. And they come into Bethany. That's the way, by the way, Mark talks. He talks in the historic present. In Mark's gospel, he says Jesus comes here, and then they come there, and then they do this, and it's all immediately this, and all that sort of thing. It's all in the present tense. And they come into Bethany, and a certain woman whose brother had died was there. And coming, she prostrated herself before Jesus and says to him, "Son of David, have mercy on me." But the disciples rebuked her, and Jesus, being angered, went off with her. And Jesus is always angry in Mark. It's very simple Greek. It's called Koine Greek, and it's a very simple way of expressing things for people who are Aramaic speakers. This is a foreign language, but they do as well as they can in it. The disciples rebuked her, and Jesus, being angered, because the disciples rebuked her, went off with her into the garden where the tomb was. Now this is the story of what? That's right, Lazarus. But what is it now? It's the story of, it's going to be much more. It's going to be part of the inner traditions and inner teachings of the secret teachings of Jesus. And straightway a great cry was heard from the tomb, and going near, Jesus rolled away the stone from the door of the tomb, and straightway going in where the youth was, he stretched forth his hand and raised him, seizing his hand. But the youth, looking upon him, loved him, and began to beseech him that he might be with him. And going out of the tomb, they came into the house of the youth, for he was rich. And after 6 days, Jesus told him what to do. And in the evening the youth comes to him, wearing a linen cloth over his naked body. And he remained with him that night, for Jesus taught him the mystery of the kingdom of God. And thence arising, he returned to the other side of the Jordan. Now, there's a little bit more here, but this is the core of what we have from the secret gospel. It's a 7-day kind of thing. The young man is led out of the tomb. Then Jesus is with him, teaching him for 6 days, and then he takes him all night long up on a mountain to teach him the mysteries, or to initiate him into the mysteries of the kingdom of the heavens. These would be the night heavens. And it's the kingdom of God, the sovereignty of God, the Malkuth. Now, this is very, very important for us to understand, because that there was initiatic tradition, and that there were some who were initiated in a very, very high way, others who were not. And apparently, Peter, James, and John were brought into a very high experience, but only in a group of 3. And an initiatic tradition, when you finally have the one-to-one experience with the guru, with the teacher, as you do in the Hermetic tradition, for example, when it's finally no longer 20 people in a class, or 5 or 3, but finally just you and the teacher, that's the highest initiation. You become a Hermes yourself, and so on. And that's traditional in initiatic tradition. So the one-to-one teaching, well, of course the Carpocratians turned this into a homosexual thing. They had things, for example, and after these words follows the text, and James and John came to him, and all that section, but, quote, naked man with naked man, and the other things about which you wrote are not found in the original text. In other words, they turned this into a homosexual initiation of some sort, and so on. So he corrects these things. This is basically what we find. It's a tremendously important kernel of information, and it gives us the understanding that there was a high form of initiation, at least in Alexandria in the 2nd century, that people were aware of, and according to Mark, the disciple of Peter, that was transmitted.
Okay, that was kind of a long slide, but it was very important for you to get all that information, and I want to take a closer look at what Clement reveals, because it's very, very pertinent to our study of Thomas. First, he reveals some very interesting things about Christian initiatic secrecy, at least in Alexandria, in Egypt. He says, "For even if they should say something true," they being the Carpocratians, "one who loves the truth should not, even so, agree with them." He points out that even things that are said that are true, if they're said by people who are liars, as a way of making a point of somehow, they should not be agreed with. He says, "One must never give way, nor should one concede that the secret gospel is by Mark, but should even deny it on oath. For not all true things are to be said to all men." Initiatic material is material that is carefully guarded. Now, if we take a look at the difference between the public gospel of Mark that Christianity has and the secret gospel of Mark, this is what he says. He says, "As for Mark, then, during Peter's stay in Rome, he wrote an account of the Lord's doings, not, however, declaring all of them, nor yet hinting at the secret ones, but selecting what he thought most useful for increasing the faith of those who were being instructed." You see, in Alexandria, in the catechetical schools, you might study for years and years before you could even be baptized. It was like a mystery school. "But when Peter died a martyr, Mark came over to Alexandria, bringing both his own notes and those of Peter." Now that implies that Peter made notes. He might have made them in Aramaic. He may have made them in Greek. Peter was not, according to this, illiterate. And Mark was his disciple, and Mark made his own notes that he learned from Peter, and Peter had made his own notes as well. And he says concerning those notes, from which he transferred to his former books, that would be the Gospel of Mark, the public Gospel of Mark, the things suitable to whatever makes for progress towards Gnosis. Now I have to point out that the word Gnosis doesn't mean Gnosticism. The word in Aramaic was manda, and Gnosis simply meant higher spiritual wisdom or knowledge, and that was a term that was used in the Alexandrian church, even though they weren't, quote, Gnostics. And this implies that then Mark took his public Gospel of Mark and he added to it and expanded it with spiritual information that he thought was suitable, not everything. Thus he composed a more spiritual gospel for the use of those who were being perfected. That is again a mystery term. We find it in the New Testament. Yeshua says, "Be ye teleos," be ye perfected. It's a mystery term meaning to make yourselves into perfect, spiritually perfected beings. And those were later called pneumatics or spirituals. And many people thought they had already achieved that status. Paul rants against the people in Corinth who had claimed they were pneumatics and they had achieved this status, etc. We find in the Gospel of Mary that Peter is rebuked for giving Mary Magdalene a hard time by saying, "Peter, put on the perfect man, the perfect Adam, the perfected humanity," and so on. So this gospel was written, a more spiritual gospel for those who were being perfected, those who were studying in the catechetical schools and so on. Nevertheless, he did not divulge the things not to be uttered. The things not to be uttered. Well, in the mystery schools, one simply did not tell what went on in the mysteries. In the whole 2,000 years of the history of the Eleusinian mysteries, we still don't know what went on in the innermost workings of them, because every initiate who was sworn to secrecy never revealed what it went on. So that's what initiatic secrecy was. It's not written down. It was known. It was given from person to person. So the things not to be uttered, there were many such things in early Christianity. Nor did he write down the hierophantic teaching of the Lord. Now, a hierophant is one who reveals the mysteries. And what Yeshua did was to reveal the ratzim of Hamalkuth, the ratzim of the sovereignty, not kingdom, but it's translated as the mysteries of the kingdom. And so he was understood to be a hierophant, a person who would reveal the mysteries of God. Nor did he write down the hierophantic teaching of the Lord, but to the stories already written he added yet others, and moreover brought in certain sayings of which he knew the interpretation would, as a mystagogue, lead the hearers into the innermost sanctuary of truth hidden by 7 veils. Now, let me explain a little bit about that. A mystagogue is your sponsor. It's the person that leads you along the path to the place where you're going to be initiated. And whether it's an Egyptian mystagogue leading a priest along the mysteries of Osiris, or a mystagogue who brings you and nominates you and brings you along the path for initiation in the Eleusinian mysteries, or whatever it is, a mystagogue is something that leads you. And so he said he knew that the certain sayings of which he knew the interpretation would, like a mystagogue, lead the hearers into the innermost sanctuary of truth. And that's what Thomas says it is. It says it is a collection of sayings that if you can find the interpretation of them, if you can understand it, that you will never die. You will be immortal. You will become perfected, etc. And he talks about this truth hidden by 7 veils. We find the 7 days of initiatic work. We find in the secret gospel, the young man who is initiated goes through a 7-day process. He's for 6 days he's brought out of the tomb, and then for 6 days he does something else. He's probably instructed, and on the 7th day he is taken up. And it's all along the pattern of the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis and the 7 days has always been used as an initiatic pattern in Kabbalistic Judaism and so on. Thus in sum he prepared matters, neither grudgingly nor incautiously, in my opinion, and dying, he left his composition to the church in one verso Alexandria, and that was where it was, only there. In one, it was a single document in Alexandria, where even yet it is most carefully guarded. Now, these documents were very carefully guarded. If we found the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Coptic literature and Hermetic literature sealed up to protect it, we may find this. One of these days, this may turn up. It may be in one of the Greek monasteries somewhere that's hidden in an archive. We don't know. But it was, even yet as of the 4th century, it was being most carefully guarded, being read only to those who are being initiated into the great mysteries. That would be the Ratzim HaMalkuth, what the King James calls the mysteries of the kingdom, that Jesus expounded in the all night long, or that he transmitted in an energetic way all night long to the young man that we hear about in this initiation. So this is what is revealed to us by this letter of Clement, which I am quite positive is authentic and was not forged in any way by Morton Smith. So the Gospel of Thomas, so-called, is a collection of initiatic sayings such as might be found in Secret Mark. Now, it isn't a recipe book for how you become perfected, but it contains sayings that you will understand as you get more advanced. And this book, the Secret Mark, such an important document, probably was not allowed to rot. It was probably never lost. And so I say, such as might be found in Secret Mark, if or when it is ever recovered. And I do expect that it's quite possible someday it will be recovered. Now, April de Konig is a scholar of both Coptic and Christianity, and I recommend her book called The Original Gospel of Thomas in translation, not because I agree with everything in it, but it is probably the closest thing we have to show you the process whereby a scholar will separate out the later versions of Thomas and the more authentic original ones. She uses a process of looking at the pre-synoptic Aramaic substratum, because the Gospel of Thomas was originally spoken. It was spoken in Aramaic and dictated to a translator or a scribe who was fluent in Aramaic and in at least the simple form of Greek known as Koine Greek that things were written down. Here are some charts of Semitisms in what she calls the kernel gospel. She's trying to get down to the earliest form of the gospel. The gospel is a collection of sayings. It's not a gospel like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, according to DeConnick, this would be the way she visualized the original kernel of these sayings and the accretions that build up over the centuries. She would see the kernel gospel as being written down sometime between 30 and 50 AD. That would be CE, the Christian era. And she chooses these by certain kinds of methodology. There are variants of the what we call the Q source, the Q source being the other document that is lost now that was written down in this period of time in the same way from an Aramaic disciple of, as Aramaic speaking disciple of Yeshua or disciple of disciple who had memorized and learned all these sayings of Yeshua, and then transmitting it to a person who was a scribe who would put it into Greek. And these are the logia that she assumes, and that's most of them. These are all variants of the Q source, and she assumes these were the original ones. She assumes that a couple of logia were accretions that occurred in the later period when there was a leadership crisis in the church and the Gentile Christianity began to be the main representation of Christianity. And there were accretions, things that were made on between that and the end of the first century, which accommodated Gentiles and the early eschatological crisis, the false idea that many of the Gentiles had that Yeshua had said the world was going to end right away, which he never did, and a shift from the idea of the sudden end of the world to a more mystical apocalyptic thought, and finally logia that were accreted in the end of the first and in the second century, about contemporary with the writing of the Gospel of John, which is the latest of the Gospels, at the time that the eyewitnesses died and there were developments of belief in Christology and theology, and Jewish Christianity was completely separated from and rejected by Gentile Christianity, and with it all the understanding and ideas that had originally been given by Yeshua were many of them either lost or just not understood. So this is her idea of the process by which all of these 114 logia were eventually put together and appeared in Greek. Now, my view of the Aramaic to Koine Greek kernel document is a little different. I disagree with her criteria for the selection of the kernel logia. Now, hers is based on the view that Yeshua taught an eschatological gospel like John the Baptist and the Essenes. The world is going to end. He was supposedly, according to her and many of the older scholars and the liberal scholars, God's imminent supernatural intervention was going to occur in human history to destroy evil and establish his sovereignty on earth. Well, of course, he's already sovereign on earth. People just don't see it. But that view was a view of that was held by Roman societies even. There are apocalyptic and eschatological views among the Romans and among the Greeks, not just among the Jews, about the coming end of the world. They were based on many things: astrological changes, the shifting of that was not understood, at least in the West, of the equinoxes and other kinds of things. And so there's much apocalyptic literature, not just among the Jews, about this, and there was much expectation of a sudden end of the world, and this was tied in with a lot of messianic speculation. Now this view, this older view of the scholars, that Yeshua also believed that and taught that, it was very much like that of Albert Schweitzer's view in The Quest of the Historical Jesus. It assumes basically that Yeshua was essentially wrong and deluded, that he expected the end of the world and it didn't happen. Now, that's not my view. I don't think that's true. I think Yeshua was the greatest master who ever walked the earth, and I think his view is much distorted, much misunderstood in early Christianity, even though the early Christians and even Paul expected the demise and the end of the world. That does not go back to the teachings of Yeshua. It goes back to a misunderstanding and to a spin that was placed on the teachings of Yeshua. So my view is that Yeshua taught a realized eschatology. It's a long, slow development. It's like the Johannine version of eschatology and that which emerged later in the church, that was steeped in Jewish Kabbalah and wisdom and Merkabah and mystical and messianic traditions of the Second Temple period. And when we study those traditions, which are accessible to us through literature that survives, the Old Testament, Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha and other kinds of literature, and in fact the kinds of scripture that Yeshua would have read and his disciples would have read, and they would have sung together in the Messianic meal as psalms and so on. If we study that literature to get a better idea of what Yeshua's concepts were and so on, we can come to no view other than this. And my view is similar to the view that many modern non-fundamentalist scholars are coming to now. So Deconic reconstructs a kernel gospel of Thomas based on eschatological criteria that I do not see as original or authentic with Yeshua, and that, I think, colors how well she's able to do that. So as we go through the Logia of Thomas, I will distinguish myself between what I consider to be authentic teachings or authentic parts of these Logia and later Gnostic editorializing. Now let's take a look at the organization and structure of the Logia and Thomas. The order of the Logia seems to be random, as many scholars have said, and it is quite true that it is very random, but on closer inspection we find some interesting things. Many Logia show original Aramaic language idioms and constructions, and these are often grouped together by theme. Many of them have affinities with the Q material, but are substantially different, as would be the case with sayings from an oral source that was independent from Q. Several groups or sequential Logia share a common word or theme which indicates a mnemonic process, that is, memorized sayings. When people memorize sayings, it's easy to remember short proverbs. It's better to give than to receive and things like that. It's very hard to remember long discourses and really complex and deep material. That is the kind of material that we can't really hold in our memory. And so the way we memorize things is by phrases and by words that group things together. And this is shown in the way the Logia are grouped together. For example, there are the will never taste death Logia, and that's by the way a Semitic idiom and therefore an Aramaism. And all of them, many of those are grouped together in both the Coptic and the Oxyrhynchus Greek manuscripts. So we know that they came linked together already. They were linked together by mnemonic, by memory structures. The implication is that the original Aramaic Logia were memorized according to common words and concepts and themes, which is an oral mnemonic process. Therefore, the original kernel Logia must have been transmitted orally in Aramaic, then dictated to a scribe who translated them into Koine Greek. Here's our methodology. We'll go line by line through the Coptic text of the Gospel of Thomas, one Logian at a time. We'll use word equivalencies, like Greek words commonly used to translate Aramaic words to recover the original Aramaic meanings. And since the Coptic version was translated from an earlier Greek version, we know the general equivalencies between Greek and Aramaic words that we can use to reconstruct the original Aramaic concepts in the historical Logia. We'll look at available Greek fragments from the Oxyrhynchus papyrus. These are for Logia 1, 2, 3, etc., and the ones that I've got listed here up through 37. And at Greek loan words in the Coptic texts, and many times we can also derive Greek from the Coptic Greek word equivalencies, and that'll lead us back to the Aramaic concepts as well. And in addition to that, there are many Egyptian words, just Coptic words, that are very closely related to Aramaic words because it's like a Semitic language. So each Logian will look at the Coptic text, identify the key terms, and comment on them. That'll be always on the first slide. Then we'll offer the best translation using paraphrase to emphasize meaning. We'll comment on the meaning of the Logian on the second and ensuing slides. And this can be a real long process. Sometimes it requires presentations on Messianic Kabbalistic mysticism contemporary with Yeshua's teaching that informed his Jewish disciples but was lost in Gentile Christianity. And to do that, I will take some of the sections from my Wisdom Seminars presentations that I have on YouTube on some of these terms like Malkuth and Maranaj, etc., to deliver a summary. The authentic teachings of Yeshua are preserved in Gnostic logia or wisdom sayings in a 2nd to 3rd century tradition, tracing its roots from the Apostle Thomas, whom it reveres as Didymus Judas Thomas, the twin Judas, which means Jew Thomas. He's honored as a twin brother of Jesus, a Savior who descended from heaven in order to redeem a small number of spiritually alive people who are known as pneumatics. Now, the Thomas traditions are all ascetic. They're anti-marriage and procreation. He's called Thomas the ascetic, or Thomas the ascetes, the spiritual athlete or contender. For this reason, the unmarried apostle was considered to be a saint in the East, where asceticism was the greatest sign of sainthood. John's Gospel, this is a Johannine tradition that competed with the disciples of Thomas, tries to marginalize Thomas as doubting Thomas. You might recall that. Now, each apostolic tradition considered its founder to be the favorite disciple of Jesus, like the Apostle John was the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. Peter is the one upon whom the church will be built, and the great apostle in Mark and Matthew and Luke and so on. And Thomas is in Thomas's Gospel. It's easy to identify Gnostic interpolation and editorializing in the Gospel of Thomas because they are revealed in special Gnostic jargon that was not part of the language of Yeshua. Some Greek terms like arche, which means the root of existence, and topos, astrological plane, and anaposis, the repose of the ascended saints in the Ogdoad, reveal that this is Gnostic stuff that's added to the teachings of Jesus. However, often just one Gnostic word is substituted in an authentic teaching, but whole logia are also sometimes just written by the Gnostics. Additionally, Greek words with no real Aramaic antecedent point to Gnostic redaction and composition, and when the Gnostic elements are removed, what remains are independent inner circle teachings of Yeshua as taught by the historical apostle Thomas or by disciples of that apostle, who is an eyewitness and a student of Yeshua. Now, for example, the prologue, the first sentence of the Gospel of Thomas is probably authentic, but the rest of the whole Logian, the second sentence, is probably Gnostic editorializing. So we're